Have you ever been alone on a mountain with nothing but the wind and the snow to keep you company? Tonight, I want to take you into a story that begins not with light, but with silence, darkness, and the kind of cold that steals the air from your lungs. Imagine a man, a wildlife photographer stranded high in the peaks, his camera frozen, his gear soaked, his sense of direction lost to the storm. He thought he had come for pictures, for art, for proof of what roams the wilderness. But what he would find was something far more powerful. And before we begin, let me ask you, if you heard the cry of a wolf echoing through the night, would you follow it, or would you run? Stay with me until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support wolf conservation. Because what happened next is a story no lens could ever capture. The night had fallen heavy and fast. Snow spiraled downward in violent sheets, burying every trail, every landmark. The mountainside looked endless, a labyrinth of white ridges and black rock, each gust of wind a reminder that nature doesn't bargain. The photographer, his name forgotten here because in moments like these, names don't matter, tumbled through waist-deep drifts, his gloves stiff, his breath clouding the beam of his failing headlamp. He was searching for shelter, for anything that could shield him from the storm. And then it came. A sound so ancient, it split the night in two. A howl. Low at first, then rising, stretching across the valley, like a thread of silver stitched into the black fabric of the blizzard. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It carried weight, authority, like a voice that had ruled these mountains long before human footsteps ever marked them. He froze. Every instinct told him to stay still. Wolves out here. He had dreamed of capturing them on film, but he hadn't expected this. Not like this. Yet something in that sound pulled him forward. Not curiosity, not fear. Something deeper, an unspoken call, as if the storm itself had given him a direction. Through the blur of snow, he stumbled undrawn toward the valley. His camera hung useless at his side, crusted with ice, but he barely noticed. Each howl was followed by silence, and in that silence, his own heartbeat grew louder, steadier, as if syncing with something beyond himself. The mountain was no longer empty. It was alive. He didn't know it yet, but the wolves were not just surviving the storm, they were protecting each other in it. And somewhere in that chaos, an alpha wolf was about to make a choice that would decide whether this man lived through the night. Before the storm took the map out of his hands, before the howl stitched a silver thread through the dark, he was simply a man on assignment. His name, let's call him Daniel Cole, rarely appeared in glossy magazines, but editors trusted him with the kinds of jobs that required patience, quiet feet, and an eye trained to find meaning where most people only saw trees and snow. He wasn't famous. He didn't want to be. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was to be present at the edge where wildness begins. Daniel grew up in a coastal town where foghorns moaned at dawn and seabirds wrote their names on the wind. He learned early that the world speaks in small sounds long before it shouts the tick of ice inside a tide pool, the hush of wings over marsh grass. When he was 19, a mentor lent him a battered manual camera and a dog-eared book on field ethics. The book said, "Do no harm, take no shortcuts, tell no lies." The camera said nothing, but it taught him to look until looking became listening. The mountains called him later. He followed elk seasons westward, then north, then higher, trading salted air for thin oxygen and sky cold enough to ring when a raven cut through it. In the northern Rockies, he learned the language of ridgelines and storm fronts. He learned snow the way sailors learn waves, by texture, by temperature, by the whisper it made when it slid off his jacket, or the punch it carried when the wind turned violent. Alone on a ridge, he began to understand that photography wasn't a hunt, it was an act of witness. This trip started 10 days before the blizzard. a small conservation group asked him to document winter corridors routes. Wildlife follow when deep cold lowers the ceiling on their world. His task was simple in the way hard things can be: spend 2 weeks tracking movements across a basin of spruce lodgepole and granite spires, then deliver a narrative that people could feel in their bones. He mapped entry points, checked weather, logged coordinates for potential blinds. He carried a GPS, spare batteries, a satellite communicator, a stove, a bivy sack. No heroics, just preparedness and respect. The basin itself was a cathedral of stone and light. By mid-afternoon, the sun went pale as if it were burning behind frosted glass. Blue shadows pooled under each tree, and in those shadows lived the secrets he had come for: the parted tuft of hair on a branch where a mule deer brushed by, the airy punctuation of snowshoe hair tracks, the long deliberate imprints of a solitary lynx. He recorded these with the care of a scribe, not to claim them, but to remember them. Wolves were rumor more than fact signs. Their stories here, a chorus reported by trappers and rangers and night shift plow drivers who swore they'd heard harmonies slide down from the ridges. Daniel wasn't after a dramatic chase or a close-up of teeth framed by steam. He hoped for something quieter, a line of tracks crossing a pass at dawn, a distant silhouette against the white flare of a winter moon, a sense of community moving with purpose through a world that rarely yields. On the 5th morning, wind lifted spindrift from the cornices and unfurled it like banners. He found the scrape of an elk bed, the burst of panic marks where the animal had exploded upward, and then there, the register of tracks he almost missed 4 toes. Oval pad, the thoughtful spacing of a wolf's walk, not one set, several. He traced them with his gloved finger, surprised at how small evidence could deliver such a large feeling. A pack had crossed lower in the basin after dawn, traveling with intention toward the river mouth, where cottonwoods made a dark braid across the snowfield. He did not follow. He watched from a ridge, glassing for movement, content to let distance do the work of reverence. The weather shifted the way a mood changes: a slight pressure, an ache behind the eyes, the quiet that comes when the forest holds its breath. Forecasts had warned of a front stacking over the range, but forecasts traffic in probabilities. On the 7th afternoon, probability became presence. Cloud decks layered themselves like slate. The wind dropped. Then the first flakes fell slow and ceremonial, as if the sky were testing its own weight. By nightfall, the snow had turned merciless. He chose a lee side below a boulder and built a temporary shelter, something to blunt the worst of the gusts. He boiled water, watched steam curl out like offerings, and considered his plan for morning. He would wait for a break, reposition, and retreat to lower ground. Storms, he knew, often grant a window an eye. If not, he would stay put until the barometer forgave him. He had the supplies to do it. He had the knowledge. What he could not predict was the way the storm would unmake the world into blankness so perfect that none of his careful lines would matter. In that blankness, sound becomes a compass. Daniel had experienced that once years earlier, when fog swallowed a coastal headland and the ocean turned invisible. He navigated by the rhythm of waves. Now the mountain drew its own map, a map of wind, the scrape of snow across bark, the subtle ticking of ice forming inside the fabric of his tent. When the headlamp began to dim, he rationed its use. When he stepped out to check his guy lines, the cold bit through 3 layers and found his bones anyway. He adjusted, recalibrated, breathed deep through a scarf until the sting subsided. He was fine, he told himself. He was trained for this. But mountains don't negotiate. It is important to say this plainly. Daniel did not come to chase wolves or court danger. He came to document a landscape and leave it undisturbed. He carried a telephoto lens precisely so he would not need to close the gap between his curiosity and their safety. He'd memorized the guidelines: never approach or bait wildlife, never reveal Dean locations, never let a photograph outweigh an animal's well-being. The storm would not care about his ethics, but he believed they mattered because he did. On the 9th day, as the front intensified, an odd calm took hold. An eye, he thought, a brief leniency. He broke camp to reposition downslope toward a sheltering stand of spruce. That move, smart on paper, became treacherous in practice. Snow had altered the topography. What looked like a gentle draw masked a field of windlips and hidden hollows. A gust pressed him sideways. He corrected, planted his pole, and in that small correction, his weight shifted onto a crust that lied. The surface collapsed. He slid 10 feet arrested, then rose with a grunt, heart hammering. No harm, he told himself. No harm, but a warning. By late afternoon, the leniency ended. The wind returned with a voice. He tried the radio. Static. He tried the satellite ping. It sent, then failed to confirm. He toggled to low power, stowed it, and calculated distance to the tree line, the angle of the slope his energy left after the slide. He could dig in here and ride it out. He could also make the wrong choice and freeze in an hour. That was when the howl came, when the valley spoke for the first time in a language older than weather reports and emergency protocols. And though he didn't know it yet, the wolves he had refused to chase had already organized themselves against a different enemy. Storm was their adversary too. The pack would not run, they would hold. And by holding, they would draw him toward the only line still visible in a world of white each other. The storm was a wall. There was no up or down, no near or far, only the sensation of moving inside a living, shifting blur. Daniel's breath fogged his scarf until the fabric froze solid against his face. Each step was a calculation. Each pause, a negotiation with fatigue. And then again, the howl. This time closer, clearer, cutting through the roar of wind like a blade through cloth. He angled toward it not because he wanted to, but because something inside him insisted. The human mind is trained to distrust the unknown, yet in that moment, the howl felt less like a warning and more like a beacon. It pulled him along the contour of the valley down toward the river mouth, where the wolves had traveled days earlier. Minutes, maybe hours, time lost its shape. Through the curtain of snow, he glimpsed movement. At first, it was only shadows, a shifting line across the white low and fluid vanishing, reappearing. He lifted his camera out of instinct, but the lens was iced over useless. He lowered it, and for the first time in his career, Daniel witnessed with nothing between him and what lived before him. The pack was gathered. Dark silhouettes circled one another in the lee of a stand of firs, their fur-bristled tails, high bodies close. Not aggression, solidarity. The wolves pressed shoulder to shoulder against the gale, creating a living wall around the youngest. Snow lashed them, yet they did not scatter. They leaned in breathing warmth into one another, holding a circle intact against the storm's siege. Daniel stood frozen, not by cold, but by awe. He had read about this, the instinct of survival, the geometry of protection. Yet seeing it unfold less than 50 yards away, seeing animals hold their line against a force that had already outmaneuvered him was different. This was not an image for a magazine spread. This was a truth about endurance, about kinship written in motion and breath. And then through the storm, one figure separated. Larger, heavier, moving with a deliberateness that made the others yield space. The Alpha. A wolf with shoulders like carved stone and eyes that gleamed with a strange steadiness even in the chaos. It lifted its head muzzle streaked with ice, and for a long second its gaze cut across the storm and landed on Daniel. He felt it not like a threat, but like recognition. The kind of recognition that transcends species, a brief acknowledgement that two beings were surviving the same trial. The alpha did not bare teeth. It did not lower ears. It simply looked, then turned padding toward the slope where Daniel stood. Fear and reverence collided inside him. He could run, but running in deep snow was folly. He could raise his arms, shout, try to appear large, but the wolf was not posturing as an aggressor. He did nothing. He stood, heart racing, as the alpha closed the distance 20 yards, 15-10. Close enough now that Daniel could see the ice rimming its fur, the steam of its breath curling away like smoke. The wolf paused. Behind it, the pack shifted, still sheltering the young. The alpha studied him with eyes the color of stormlight, then turned its head sharply, a gesture precise and unmistakable. A glance down slope toward a darker band in the valley where fir trees thickened and snow seemed less brutal. A place of shelter. Daniel blinked. Could it be coincidence wolves were masters of terrain? They knew where wind broke and where prey sought refuge. Maybe the alpha was simply surveying its world, but the timing, the deliberate glance, the way it held his gaze, before and after, felt like instruction, like a guide. He stepped once in the direction the wolf had indicated. The alpha's ears flicked. It did not move closer, nor retreat. Another step. The wolf turned, padded a few strides down slope, then paused, looking back. An invitation. And so, Daniel followed. Not in the way a man follows an animal to conquer or to capture, but in the way one being places trust in another when every other option has vanished. He stumbled, corrected, pressed on, eyes fixed on the dark shape, moving with certainty through the storm. At intervals, the alpha would stop, look back, wait. Each pause steadied Daniel, gave him bearings. The pack did not follow. They remained huddled around their young, holding the circle intact. It was as though the alpha had divided its duty, one eye for the vulnerable, one for the stranger. The trek felt endless, but eventually the land shifted. The wind eased. Trees rose around him, breaking the violence of the storm. He collapsed against a trunk chest, heaving body, trembling not just with cold, but with the enormity of what had transpired. He looked up. The wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, snow clinging to its coat like armor. For one final moment, it held his gaze. Then it turned and vanished back into the white. Daniel was left alone, but no longer lost. He had shelter, direction, and the echo of a presence that had guided him through the storm. His camera still hung at his side, useless, but that night it did not matter. The image burned in his mind was sharper than any lens could render, the sight of a pack woven tight against the blizzard, and the alpha's eyes holding his until he understood. Shelter is a verb before it becomes a place. Daniel learned that within minutes of reaching the trees. He scraped a hollow behind a fallen fir where the wind broke into gentler threads, then stacked boughs for a windscreen. He shook out his bivvy, unrolled his pad, and worked heat back into his hands by clenching and unclenching fists inside damp gloves. The storm still spoke, but not in shouts now, more like a steady, relentless sentence he could read one word at a time. He took stock. Stove functional. Fuel half a canister. Water frozen solid in one bottle, slush in the other. He chipped snow into the pot, melted it slow, added electrolytes, and drank. The first swallow hit like light. He forced himself to eat peanut butter packet jerky, a handful of nuts, even though hunger had been replaced by a strange, hollow focus. He set his boots under his jacket to keep them from turning to stone. Only then did he allow himself to replay what had happened, the pack holding a circle, the alpha's deliberate glance, that quiet, impossible exchange. He did not romanticize it. He refused to invent intention where survival might be enough. But even stripped of mythology, the facts remained. The wolf had led him into cover, and that choice had likely saved him. As night thickened, a fresh danger set its hooks cold fatigue. He recognized the first slips, clumsy fingers, a creeping softness in thought, the urge to doze that comes not from rest, but from surrender. He set a timer on his watch for 15-minute intervals, a tactic he'd learned from a winter rescue instructor who'd once told him, "Sleep kills when cold sits in the room." Each time the alarm buzzed, he moved sit-ups in the bivvy toe curls, air squats inside the cramped shelter. Anything to remind blood what it was for. Between alarms, he listened. Wolves talk in many dialects, howls, yips, whines, the crisp percussion of paws through crust. Near midnight he heard a chorus sanded by distance. Not the long territorial proclamation he'd heard earlier, but shorter phrases layered overlapping. He pictured the pack repositioning within the tree belt, aligning bodies to block wind for the smallest ribs. He pictured breath pooling in a shared space, a microclimate measured in degrees that separate life from its absence. They were working the storm like professionals. Just before dawn, the wind thinned. Daniel broke the bivvy seal, and snow dusted his face like flour. The sky was a pale bruise, starless. He ate again, warmed water again, and considered the day. Moving blindly would add risk without purpose. He would hold here, conserve fuel, wait for a visible horizon. If he got a satellite lock, he could ping coordinates and receive a delayed forecast. If conditions eased, he could begin a careful descent along the tree line. He checked his communicator and climbed one log higher to improve line of sight. A single bar flickered, then died. On the second try, the unit caught a thin thread of sky and scent. He waited. Confirmation failed again. He sent a short text to the conservation group. "Anyway, storm sheltering tree line will report when able, then turned the unit off to preserve battery." Movement to his left snapped thought back to the present. 50 yards away between the trunks, a shadow slid from one tree to the next. Then another. He stayed still. The pack had relocated into the same belt of firs. He could make out at least 6 forms in the dim. They moved with the economy of animals that did not waste the smallest action. One adult nudged a yearling forward. The yearling resisted, then complied, learning by proximity how to place feet, how to lean windward without surrendering balance. The alpha appeared last, emerging from a seam in the trees, like a piece of night deciding to turn into shape. It surveyed the corridor, then the slope, then lifted its nose to test the air. Daniel watched its chest rise and fall. Steam drifted from its mouth like banners, then vanished. Instinct pushed him to raise his camera. Ethics pulled his hand back down. This was not the time to break distance, not the place to hunt an image. He had what he needed, the memory, and he had a responsibility not to alter theirs. He stayed small, stayed quiet, let the forest be the forest. By mid-morning, the snow steadied into a soft, persistent sift. The wind calmed enough that the pack could move in measured lines. They spaced themselves so that the smallest traveled between larger bodies. When drifts deepened, 2 adults tandem broke a channel with their chests, then yielded to others when they tired. Cooperation wasn't a theory you proved with arguments. It was a path you left behind you. Daniel tracked them only with his ears and the occasional glimpse through trunks. The wolves kept their distance, as if an invisible ring had been chalked into the snow around him and agreed upon by all parties. That ring respect was in everyone's best interest. Not all enemies were invisible cold. By noon, a brittle crack echoed downslope, the sound of a loaded limb surrendering under the weight of ice. The crack became a tearing rush. Then the blow of a branch knifing into his windscreen and buckling it. Snow filled the gap with cruel speed. Daniel threw his shoulder against the fallen limb and shoved. It shifted an inch, then another, then caught. He dug with gloves, scooped with his pot, carved with his knife, opening a breathing hole as powder tried to repossess his small country of warmth. The commotion triggered a response he did not expect. A single short howl rose from the left, close followed by 2 answering notes deeper in the trees. Not alarm, a check-in. The alpha appeared in the periphery of his vision, held for 3 heartbeats, as if to confirm the strange biped was still upright, then vanished. The storm stitched the holes closed with its usual patience. Afternoon brought hunger with teeth. High-calorie food tastes like contrition after enough hours in the cold, but Daniel ate. He rationed. He did math. Fuel would run out tomorrow at this rate. He cut the schedule to 1 hot meal, 1 hot drink, the rest cold. He checked the communicator again, nothing. He pulled his hood down to listen and caught a new pattern, ravens. 2 of them, maybe 3, the clucking conversation they tend to hold when wolves feed. So the pack had found calories, probably an elk that didn't outrun the front or fell and fractured something beyond repair. Grief for the elk coexisted with relief for the wolves. This is how winter makes everything honest. He did not go looking. He kept to his shelter and let the day turn. Dusk arrived early, like a door closing in a quiet house. Cold took advantage of the opening and walked back in. He ran drills, count to 60, breathing slow push-ups until triceps trembled, toe curls until calves protested. When the timer sounded, he disciplined himself to move again, instead of bargaining for a few more minutes of stillness. The minor crisis came without fanfare. Sometime after nightfall, he noticed that his words to himself, to the air, were blurring at the edges. He fumbled his stove, nearly spilled his last planned hot drink, and when he looked down, his hands were pale and stiff in a way that scared him. The slow slide toward hypothermia had begun to grease the floor under his feet. This is the moment where tiny choices matter. He forced heat into water, filled a bottle, wrapped it in a spare wool sock, and jammed it against his femoral artery inside his pants. He repeated the move on the other leg with the last of the hot water. He cycled his gloves under his jacket, skin to fabric warmth trading places like dancers. He stripped off the damp base layer and replaced it with the emergency shirt vacuum sealed at the bottom of his pack. He pulled the bivvy tight and hummed, not for morale, but because sound requires breath, and breath requires heat. The slide slowed. He held the edge and didn't go over. Outside, the pack's voices lifted again. This time, the alpha's note threaded through the others, calm and resonant. Daniel couldn't translate it, but he could measure its effect on his own pulse. The beat steadied. The mind cleared. On some level, the presence of other living things working the same night wrote a sentence he needed to read, not alone. Near midnight, a sputter on the communicator surprised him. A message had crawled through the ether at last, a delayed forecast update piggybacked from the earlier ping. Winds easing at dawn. Visibility improving. Temperatures still severe. The note was clinical, but to Daniel, it read like permission. He could move in the morning. He could aim down the tree line, take the long way out, avoid gullies and cornices and their buried traps. If luck held, he could reach lower timber by afternoon and build a proper camp. He shut the device off, smiled into the dark, and saved that small heat. He slept in pieces and woke before first light to the sound of raven wings. The storm had reduced itself to a whisper. In the half-quiet, he broke down. The windscreen rolled his gear and prepped a route mentally contour along the line of firs, past the notch where the pack had funneled keep elevation until the slope eased, then pivot to a game trail he'd marked 2 days earlier. He looked up and saw them one last time that morning. The pack in motion, a paired procession, moving with the confidence of animals who had been given the test and passed. The yearling trotted within the corridor of bodies. The alpha ghosted the flank scanning. They did not look at him. They did not need to. Their arc bent toward a crease in the ridge that likely held shelter food, and a rendezvous site where pups would once again turn sound into a map. He didn't take a picture. He didn't need one. He breathed, shouldered his pack, and placed his first step into a day that had finally decided to be a day. He would trace his way out with care. If all went right, he would leave only the lightest signatures, the shallow trough of a boot line, and beside it, something else he hadn't noticed until he looked down. The night's wind had slashed and worried the snow, but in the protected pocket by his bivvy, 2 sets of prints had survived his large and clumsy, and a second parallel set from where the alpha had stood to check on him after the branch fall. The stride matched for a few paces, boot paw, then diverged. He smiled at the accident of it. At least he told himself he hoped it was an accident. Meaning is a dangerous seasoning to add to wild facts. But even stripped of that seasoning there, they were 2 paths briefly in agreement, 2 lives intersecting not in possession, but in passage. He stepped away, careful as a signature written on fresh paint, and began the long traverse out. By morning, the storm had eased its grip, but mountains are reluctant to forgive. Daniel's path forward looked simple on paper. Stay in the shelter of trees, contour the slope, and descend toward lower timber. Yet simplicity in the backcountry is often a disguise. Snow hides fractures. Ice disguises water. Wind sculpts illusions that appear solid until they collapse beneath you. And when mountains collapse, they do not argue. They fall. The air was painfully clean, every breath sharp as glass. Daniel checked his pack secured straps and tested the communicator again. Silence. He drew a line in his mind, a steady descent, no shortcuts, no hubris. Each step measured each decision small. He was not out of danger. He was only invited to continue. For hours he moved inside that rule. The forest kept its promise trees breaking wind into manageable gusts. Tracks accompanied him, deer hare raven. Once he glimpsed the pack ahead, their procession threading a notch higher on the ridge, parallel but separate. He felt less like a follower now, and more like a witness moving beside a current he could not touch, but could feel. The danger revealed itself just after noon. A basin opened before him, broad and white, framed by cliffs that had collected more snow than they could bear. He stopped at the tree line and scanned. The surface looked quiet, smooth, deceptive. He felt the prickle behind his ears, the old instinct that whispers when something waits. He adjusted his route to skirt the basin rather than cross it. But the mountain had already decided the scene. A sound cracked the stillness. Not thunder, not wind, a fracture. It rolled like a gunshot across stone. Then the slope above him split. Snow detached in slow motion, then gathered speed, an ocean breaking loose. An avalanche. Daniel bolted. His boots punched through drifts, legs burning. He angled sideways, the only way to escape the freight train of white bearing down. The ground trembled. A roar swallowed the valley. He glanced up once enough to see the wall of snow collapsing with the fury of a planet rearranging itself. And then a second sound, a howl. Not distant, not ceremonial, urgent. The Alpha's voice, raw and commanding, carried above the avalanche's roar. Daniel snapped his head toward it. To his left on a ridge, tongue jutting into the basin, the wolf stood tail high, body braced. It howled again, then leapt down slope, moving with precision across a line of buried rock outcrops invisible to Daniel until that moment. A safe route, a thread through chaos. Adrenaline carved clarity into his mind. He pivoted, followed the wolf's line boots slipping, arms pumping. Snow thundered behind him, throwing spray like surf. He hit the first outcrop, scrambled, leapt to the next. The wolf was ahead, bounding from rock to rock, never once looking back, yet never vanishing from sight. Each landing mark was a decision made before him, a map written in motion. halfway across the avalanche's edge, kissed the route. Daniel dove, felt the cold flood over his legs clawed upward. He kicked, pushed lungs screaming. His glove tore his wrist, scraped stone, but he hauled himself clear. The wolf was 20 yards ahead, silhouetted against chaos, body black against the cataract of snow. It did not slow, it did not falter, and so Daniel did not stop. Minutes stretched like hours. The avalanche passed, carving the basin into ruin, leaving silence heavy as stone. Daniel collapsed onto the last outcrop chest, heaving body trembling with exertion. He looked up. The wolf stood one ridge higher, snow steaming from its coat breath, billowing in clouds. It met his eyes once a moment, carved from the violence they had outrun. Then it turned and disappeared into timber. He laughed, not a sound of humor, but of disbelief, relief, awe. The mountain had thrown its weight. He should not have survived. Yet survival had arrived in the shape of a wolf, guiding him across a line only wolves knew. His camera still hung unused, but some images refuse the lens. They live only in memory, sharper than glass, permanent as scars. The basin was unrecognizable. A wave of snow had bulldozed trees, buried tracks, silenced ravens. Yet Daniel was alive, and life is measured not by untouched landscapes, but by the breaths taken after chaos. He pressed on, weaker now, but steadier. Every step was a thank you to the unseen guide ahead. As the sun dipped, he found himself in lower timber, the air marginally softer, the wind less cruel. He set camp beneath a spruce heavy with snow, built a small fire from deadfall, and let smoke climb like a prayer. The warmth brought back sensation in his fingers, the pain of returning blood, sharp but welcome. He sipped melted snow, chewed jerky, and stared into the flames. The night settled different now, not as a prison, but as a reminder. Somewhere above the pack, regrouped their howls, stitching the mountains back together after the avalanche had torn them apart. He listened, and when the alpha's voice rose again, he felt not fear, not even reverence, but kinship. They had both chosen routes through danger. They had both led lives through chaos. And in that strange symmetry, survival had become a shared story. Survival is never just about storms or avalanches. Once you return from the mountains, survival changes shape. It becomes about rules, laws, and the fears of other people. Daniel descended into the valley with his body intact, but his mind carrying something harder to explain. A story that sounded like myth, a rescue delivered not by rope or beacon, but by a wolf. And in a world run by human systems, myths rarely find a welcome seat at the table. By the third day of descent, he reached a ranger station. His clothes were stiff with salt, his face wind-burned raw, his camera case heavy with ice, though empty of images. The ranger listened, jaw tight, eyes narrowing at every mention of the pack. Protocol is clear in places like this. Wolves are federally protected, monitored by collars and surveys. Any suggestion of close human contact triggers questions. Were you feeding them? Did you approach a den? Did you interfere with behavior? Each question implied risk, not only to him, but to the wolves. Daniel explained what he could. The storm, the avalanche, the pack huddled together against the gale, the alpha's movements that had shown him a safe line. He kept his voice calm, factual, never straying into embellishment. Yet the ranger leaned back, arms crossed. You followed wolves during a blizzard. It wasn't accusation yet, but it was close. He knew the law: you cannot harass or pursue protected wildlife. He also knew what pursuit means in court. It means altering natural behavior, endangering the animal. He insisted he hadn't followed them, hadn't closed the gap. I was moving parallel, he said. The storm erased everything. They were simply there. Still doubt hung heavy. In the legal frame, a man in the woods with wolves nearby, is already a complication. News traveled. A local paper picked up fragments of his return, painting him as a reckless photographer who chased wolves into a storm. Online forums flared. Some voices demanded penalties for endangering the pack. Others romanticized him as a man saved by spirits of the wild. Both versions distorted the truth. He wanted neither punishment nor myth. He wanted accuracy. He had been guided by circumstance, by instinct, maybe by coincidence, but certainly by wolves. And that was enough. Then came the conservation board meeting. He was invited, or summoned depending on perspective, to share his account. Around the table sat biologists, wardens, and representatives of local ranchers. Wolves carry a history that precedes any one story. For ranchers, wolves mean risk to livestock, to livelihood. For biologists, wolves mean data management, fragile recovery after near extinction. For policymakers, wolves mean politics. Into that fire walked Daniel with nothing but his story. He began with the storm, the blizzard's violence, the collapse of his shelter, the avalanche tearing the basin apart. He spoke with precision, avoiding flourishes, presenting what happened as clearly as possible. But when he described the pack holding their young, when he described the alpha's eyes and the deliberate path across the outcrops, the room shifted. Some leaned forward curious, others stiffened skeptical. One rancher muttered fairy tales. Another biologist whispered, incredible. The chairwoman cleared her throat. Mr. Cole, do you understand the implications of what you're claiming? If a wolf altered its path because of you, that's human interference. If you tracked them closer than regulation distance, that's a violation. You could face fines. He nodded. I understand. But I didn't alter them. They altered me. Silence. The phrase hung awkwardly between law and poetry. A warden scribbled notes. A lawyer frowned. Someone coughed into their sleeve. Wolves were never supposed to be teachers. They were supposed to be data points, management units, checkboxes on a spreadsheet. The idea that one had guided a man through danger unsettled the frame. If true, it challenged assumptions. If false, it romanticized a predator too easily vilified or adored. Outside the boardroom, conflict thickened. Neighbors questioned his judgment. What if they'd attacked? What if you'd led them toward town? Online, critics mocked his lack of photos, convenient that the camera froze. Even friends urged him to soften the story, make it metaphor rather than memory. But he refused. He would not paint wolves as saviors or devils. He would describe what happened. They endured, they moved, they lived beside him in a night that would have killed him alone. Still, the law loomed. He was warned not to return to that basin without explicit permits. His story was flagged in management reports filed under unverified encounter. He was advised strongly not to repeat it publicly, lest it encourage amateurs to seek their own mythical rescues. That was the paradox. The truer the story, the more dangerous it seemed to bureaucrats. A story of connection might tempt intrusion, might invite those who romanticize wolves to step too close. Protection sometimes means silence, and Daniel respected that. He never shared GPS coordinates. He never disclosed exact times or landmarks. He carried the details like fragile glass, holding them close, telling the story without revealing the den. He placed the wolves' safety above his pride, but he could not erase what he had lived. And no regulation could erase the parallel tracks he had seen, boot and paw side by side etched into snow. The greater conflict lived not in offices or newspapers, but in himself. A photographer's purpose is to show, to document, to reveal. Yet here was the greatest moment of his career, and it existed only in memory. No image, no footage, no proof, only words. And words were contested territory. He lay awake nights wondering, had he imagined the alpha's glance? Had adrenaline written illusion into fact? But then he remembered the basin, the avalanche, the impossibility of surviving without that precise path. He remembered the way the wolf had paused, ears flicked, then leapt again, as if inviting him forward. No camera was needed. He had his body as evidence alive. Every story with wolves has a threshold, the point where wonder collides with responsibility. For Daniel, that threshold came weeks later, long after the bruises had faded and the storm's roar had dulled in memory. He had told his story to rangers, endured skepticism, shouldered warnings. Yet the hardest part wasn't defending himself. It was realizing that his connection with the wolves had to end. He returned to the mountains once more that winter, not to photograph, not to chase, but to reconcile. He hiked into lower valleys, where the snow melted thinner across open meadows, where elk prints stitched the ground into a diary of hunger and survival. He carried no telephoto lens this time, only binoculars, a notebook, and a promise to himself to keep his distance to observe without trespassing. For days he walked ridges parallel to where he thought the pack might roam. He heard them twice, once a chorus echoing at dusk, once a solitary howl before dawn, but he never closed the space. He sat on a ridge, wrote in his notebook, and admitted the truth. The closer I want to be, the further I must remain. Then came the morning of farewell. A late snow had drifted across the valley, softening everything into a blank page. Daniel moved carefully along a timberline, glassing the distance with his binoculars. At first, he saw nothing, just wind teasing the snow into ghostly ribbons. Then, movement, a line of bodies weaving across a meadow, black against white, deliberate and calm. The pack. He froze, though they were far beyond the safe boundary. Through the glass, he could see yearlings larger now, muscles filling in where ribs had once shown. Adults moved with the confidence of survivors. And at the flank, steady and unhurried, the alpha. The same wolf, unmistakable, its gait, measured shoulders rolling like tide against stone. The pack did not alter course. They crossed the meadow with the same indifference given to ravens or elk. But midway, the alpha paused. It lifted its head, eyes scanning the ridge where Daniel sat. Binoculars lowered, breath held. Across that distance, recognition sparked not ownership, not dependence, but acknowledgement. A glance sharp enough to bridge the void of air and snow between species. Daniel raised a hand, not high, not waving, but a quiet salute, a gesture of respect. He did not expect response. Yet the wolf held his gaze a beat longer, then tipped its head back and gave a single short howl. Not the long proclamation of territory, not the chorus of kin, just one note, crisp and solitary, that carried like a thread tied between them. The pack moved on. Snow closed their prints within minutes. The alpha was the last to vanish into timber tail, sweeping once like a curtain. Silence returned thick and whole. Daniel remained on the ridge until dusk. He did not follow. He did not step into the meadow. He knew this was the end, not of the wolves' story, but of his part in it. They belonged to themselves, to the wilderness, to the rhythm of prey and snow and time. He belonged to the role of witness. That was enough. He closed his notebook with a decision: he would not chase wolves again. He would photograph landscapes, tracks, shadows if fortune allowed, but he would never again seek the intimacy that storm had forced upon him. To do so would betray the very lesson the alpha had given. That connection is most sacred when it refuses to be possessed. Back in town, opportunities came. Publishers asked for articles, magazines requested interviews. Some wanted him to frame it as folklore, the night a wolf saved a man. Others wanted him to sharpen it into controversy, reckless photographer risks protected species. He declined both. Instead, he wrote one long essay, honest, measured, stripped of myth, yet full of reverence. He described the storm the pack's circle of protection, the avalanche the path across the outcrops. He left out locations omitted detail that might expose the wolves to intrusion. He ended with a single sentence. The only photograph worth carrying was the one I could never take parallel tracks, paw and boot side by side in snow. The essay was published in a conservation journal, not a glossy magazine. It didn't go viral, didn't flood comment sections, but it found the right readers. Wildlife biologists, rangers, those who understood the fragile balance between myth and management. Quietly, letters arrived at his inbox, thank yous from strangers who worked in wolf country, who saw in his words a careful respect. Still, farewells echo. Nights later, Daniel dreamt of the howl again, short, solitary, the one the alpha had given him across the meadow. He woke with tears not of sorrow, but of gratitude. He understood at last the farewell wasn't an ending. It was a handoff. The wolves had given him a story, and his responsibility was to carry it truthfully, humbly, without distortion. Months passed. The storm became history. The avalanche just a scar on the landscape. The wolves once again invisible threads weaving through the mountains. For Daniel, however, the story did not fade. It followed him into every room he entered, every lecture hall where conservationists gathered, every conversation with people who wanted to hear the wolf tale. He spoke carefully, always carefully. He stripped away exaggeration, left out coordinates, refused to give the story a shape that could tempt thrill-seekers into reckless pursuits. Yet even stripped down, the story carried weight. People leaned in when he described the pack huddled against the blizzard. Their eyes softened when he spoke of the alpha, pausing on a ridge, looking back as if waiting. And when he told of the avalanche and the wolf's deliberate path across buried outcrops, silence filled the room. Silence that was not disbelief, but respect. Some listeners, scientists, skeptics, asked the hard questions. Could it be coincidence? Was Daniel projecting meaning onto an instinctive movement? He always answered the same way. It may have been coincidence, but that coincidence gave me life. For him, truth lived not in proving intention, but in acknowledging impact. Whether the wolf meant to guide him or not, he had survived because of that path. And survival was fact enough. Letters continued to arrive. A biology student wrote that the essay had inspired her to study wolf behavior. A park ranger sent a note. Thank you for reminding people, wolves are neither monsters nor saints, just survivors. Even a rancher once skeptical wrote privately, I don't trust wolves near my cattle. But I respect the way you told this story without asking me to worship them. Still, controversy lingered. Certain outlets twisted the narrative into clickbait. Man saved by wolf spirit blared one headline. Another site accused him of fabricating the entire ordeal to sell books. Daniel refused to respond. Wolves didn't need more mythology or more fights in comment sections. They needed space. They needed silence. So he let the noise wash past him and returned to work, quiet work. He began photographing landscapes instead of chasing animals, valleys folded in winter-light rivers, carving through snowfields, ridges glowing under full moons. He still carried his camera, but he carried something else now too, restraint. He no longer sought the shot that would make headlines. He sought the images that reminded people of context, of belonging, of scale. And then one morning in late spring, he returned to the ridge where it had all begun, not to chase wolves, not even to see them, but to stand where storm had stripped him bare and where a howl had given him direction. The basin was green now, grass pushing through thaw avalanche debris, scattered like bones of winter. Life was loud again, birds trilling, insects buzzing the wind, softer, full of sap. He stood there for hours. No wolves appeared. None needed to. He traced the line of outcrops with his eyes, remembering the leap, The scramble, the sound of snow collapsing. He placed his hand on a stone, warm now under sun, and felt time compress, storm and silence, howl and path, all folded into one memory. As he turned to leave, a sound drifted faintly from beyond the ridge. Not close, not directed at him, just a howl, casual part of the wolves' endless conversation. It rose, lingered, then faded. Daniel smiled. He didn't need to see them. He only needed to know they were still here, still moving, still writing their own story. Back home, he shaped his final words for the essay's sequel. He wrote not about survival or heroics, but about humility. I once thought the camera was my witness. I now know the land itself is witness enough. Wolves do not need us to mythologize them. They need us to respect the space between us, to honor the distance that allows them to remain wild. My story is not proof of anything except this: we are not alone in the world. And sometimes survival comes not from conquering nature, but from listening to it. The essay ended there. No flourish, no photograph, just truth, quiet, and unfinished, the way wilderness always is. Stories about wolves have always carried more than teeth and fur. They carry our fears, our myths, our long history of seeing ourselves in their eyes. Some call them monsters, some call them spirits. But the truth, quiet, stubborn, and necessary, is simpler. Wolves are survivors. They are families bound by loyalty, creatures who endure storms by standing shoulder to shoulder, who carve paths through chaos, because together is the only way forward. Daniel's story is not about a miraculous rescue. It is about recognition. A man caught in a blizzard, stripped of control, guided perhaps by coincidence, perhaps by instinct, onto the same path as wolves. For one night, survival did not belong to a single species. It belonged to connection. And that is the message worth carrying. Survival is not always measured by what we capture on film or keep in memory cards. Sometimes it is measured by the invisible bonds that remind us we are not alone in the wilderness. Bonds that do not demand possession, only respect. For Daniel, the lesson was humility. The greatest photograph he never took was not a flaw in his work, but a gift, the chance to remember without owning, to witness without altering. For us, the lesson is responsibility. Wolves do not need our myths. They need space, silence, and protection under law. They need humans willing to honor distance, willing to defend the wild places where their howls still rise against the wind. So the story closes, not with conquest, not with proof, but with gratitude. Gratitude that in a storm that erased maps, a howl gave direction. Gratitude that in a world quick to fear or idolize, we can choose instead to respect. Gratitude that the tracks in Snowboot and Paw side by side remind us of the fragile line that connects us to everything beyond ourselves.